The voice of the HOA president tore across the quiet morning like a buzzsaw. "You're fishing illegally, and you'll be fined." She stood on the dock, eyes burning with authority, glaring at me as though she had caught some hardened criminal instead of a man enjoying his morning by the lake. I smiled faintly, holding my rod steady, the mist lifting off Clearwater Lake around me. She didn't know the truth I carried. What she thought was a petty intimidation game was about to unravel into the worst mistake of her career. Her name was Margaret Sloan, president of the Homeowners Association. She thrived on power, wielding regulations like weapons. But she didn't realize who I was, or the history tied to the land she thought she ruled. The sacred spot. I had been fishing for about 20 minutes in the exact place where my grandfather, William Hayes, had taught me the patience of casting a line. His words echoed, "Patience, son. The big ones take time." This wasn't just any spot, it was sacred ground. A place where I had learned that sometimes silence holds the deepest conversations. Behind me stood our old family cabin. To outsiders it looked weathered, but to me every board carried decades of summers, lessons, and memories. That peace shattered when Margaret came storming toward me, her manicured finger already aimed at my chest. Trailing her was Jason Miller, the HOA manager. He was built like a linebacker but carried the mental sharpness of a burnt-out light bulb. He was already fumbling with his phone, likely preparing to record one of his ridiculous citizen's arrest videos. "Excuse me, sir," Margaret barked, her voice loud enough to echo over the water. "You are in violation of HOA Regulation 23C regarding unauthorized recreational activities in designated preservation zones." She pulled out a fat folder and waved it like scripture. Jason nodded eagerly, like a bobblehead doll. What they didn't know was that I'd been expecting them. For weeks, I'd noticed survey equipment appearing mysteriously after dark near the water. 3 days earlier, I'd even seen industrial measuring devices submerged beneath the surface. That wasn't about fishing, it was about development. Someone wanted this lake cleared of witnesses. Standing my ground. "Ma'am, I wasn't aware of any posted rules," I said calmly, reeling in my line. "Could you show me exactly where they're displayed? My grandfather fished this spot for 40 years. Her eyes twitched at the mention of my grandfather. I caught Jason shooting her a nervous glance. "And another question," I continued, still calm. "Who exactly gave the HOA authority over natural water sources that existed long before this subdivision?" Her composure cracked. "The authority comes from covenants filed in 1987, she snapped. "Every property owner agreed to abide by them. I need to see your identification immediately." Jason was still recording as if this were a drug bust instead of a man holding a fishing pole. Time to drop a seed of truth. I extended my hand. "Hayes," I said. "Daniel Hayes. My family's connection to this land goes back long before your covenants. My grandfather, William Hayes, always said this lake was meant to be protected for future generations." Her face flickered with uncertainty, though she quickly recovered. "I don't care who your grandfather was," she snapped. She scribbled furiously on her citation pad and tore out a slip. "This is a $500 fine. You have 24 hours to vacate." I folded the paper and slid it into my shirt pocket. "Maybe check those property records before you start throwing around threats," I said softly. "And Jason, you might want to be careful filming people on their own property." Their confused expressions told me everything. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Not yet. Escalation. The next morning I found 3 more citations taped to my cabin door. Grass height, paint color, unauthorized furniture. Margaret was flinging every rule she could find. By noon, a Riverside Utilities van pulled up. Workers began disconnecting my water, citing unpaid HOA fees. An hour later the power company showed up, and by evening, my internet service was mysteriously suspended. But every fraudulent order only strengthened my case. I documented everything, photos of citations, utility shut-off tags, even Jason's absurd lawn measuring photos. In one of them, I noticed a white pickup truck with Summit Peak Development logos just out of frame. The puzzle was forming. That evening, I called Eleanor Price, my grandfather's old friend and lawyer. Most neighbors thought she was just a retired attorney living quietly. They had no idea she was the keeper of my grandfather's secrets. She answered with a voice of calm steel. "Daniel, I've seen Margaret's antics. She's overreaching. It's time we open your grandfather's safe." The safe. The next morning, I met Eleanor at her colonial-style home. We went down to her basement, where a steel safe was built into the foundation. Your grandfather made me promise to wait until you were 30, she said, spinning the lock. He said the wrong hands could destroy lives. The right hands could save this community. Inside lay documents, photographs, and decades of correspondence. The first one nearly floored me. The original 1962 deed showing William Hayes had purchased 840 acres around Clearwater Lake, including the roads, the common areas, the lake itself, and the land beneath every home in the development. The HOA had never owned any of it. They were tenants pretending to be landlords. Eleanor pulled out more folders, letters documenting decades of overreach, inflated contracts, and fraud. Margaret wasn't the first corrupt president, but she was the boldest. She had signed secret agreements with Summit Peak Development, promising them a $50 million casino resort deal. A hotel tower, marina, shopping center, the entire natural ecosystem destroyed. But the biggest shock came at the bottom of the safe, my grandfather's will. It stated that upon my 30th birthday, I became the legal owner of the Hayes Family Trust, which controlled all 840 acres. I had inherited it 6 months ago. For half a year, Margaret had been issuing fines and threats on land I owned. I looked at Eleanor in disbelief. She lowered her eyes, then spoke softly. There's more. Your grandfather wasn't just my client. He was my father. The words hit like a thunderclap. Eleanor was my aunt. My family was bigger than I'd ever known. The showdown. The next days turned chaotic. Margaret escalated to vandalism, smashed windows, graffiti screaming squatter. She even sent hired muscle posing as inspectors. But I stayed calm, filming everything. The turning point came when Channel 7 News showed up. A reporter broadcast live about a resident battling his HOA over land rights and environmental protection. Margaret tried to shut it down, but the story was out. Community members began questioning her. Rumors spread. Then the sheriff returned with a search warrant for the HOA office. Investigators carried out boxes of documents, computers, and fraudulent financial records. Margaret screamed about harassment, but panic was written across her face. Finally, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Over 200 residents packed the hall. Margaret opened with her usual arrogance, accusing me of lies and harassment. That's when I stood, holding up the deed. This, I said loudly, is the original 1962 deed. My grandfather bought all 840 acres, including this lake and the land under every one of your homes. The HOA never owned this land. Gasps filled the room. Eleanor handed out copies. People's faces changed as they realized they had been paying fees to a fraud. Then I dropped the bomb. The Summit Peak Development contracts. Margaret planned to sell what she doesn't own. $50 million for a casino resort that would erase this lake forever. The hall erupted. Shouts, anger, betrayal. Margaret's denials crumbled. Jason slipped out the back, but was intercepted by deputies with an arrest warrant. Margaret panicked, fumbling with her phone. In the chaos, she accidentally called a pizza place instead of her lawyer. Her desperate pleas went out live on the microphones. You have to help me. They're destroying everything. To which the confused teenager on the line asked if she wanted breadsticks. The room erupted in laughter. Her empire was finished. Sheriff deputies stepped forward and placed her under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Resolution. Months passed. Margaret went to prison. Jason followed with charges of his own. Summit Peak Development faced federal penalties. The community voted to dissolve the HOA and establish the Hayes Nature Preserve, managed transparently by the Hayes Family Trust. Families now enjoy picnics, hiking trails, and a new education center. Kids learn fishing and conservation where bulldozers might have stood. Monthly costs dropped, and trust replaced corruption. Wildlife flourished, with endangered birds returning to nest along the lake. Eleanor and I created a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name to support students studying conservation and environmental science. His legacy lives on, not just in the land, but in future generations. One afternoon, I saw a familiar figure on the path. Margaret, released early on parole. She stopped at the new sign, Hayes Nature Preserve, fishing welcome. She stared for a long moment, shoulders slumped, then muttered, I lost everything, just because he was fishing. I sat back in my grandfather's rocking chair, rod in hand, and smiled. Sometimes the smallest actions, like casting a line, set in motion the biggest consequences. Margaret learned that the hard way. And thanks to my grandfather's foresight, Clearwater Lake will remain untouched, protected, and free forever.